The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Anderson Cooper adjusted his navy blue blazer one final time. The CNN anchor had covered wars, natural disasters, and political scandals, but today felt different. Today, he was about to sit down with members of the British royal family for what was supposed to be an exclusive interview about their upcoming charity initiatives. Anderson had spent weeks preparing for this moment. His team had submitted questions in advance, gone through multiple security clearances, and followed every protocol demanded by the palace press office. The interview was scheduled to take place in the Blue Drawing Room, a stunning chamber adorned with silk wallpaper and priceless artwork that had witnessed countless historic moments. As Anderson walked through the palace corridors, flanked by his small camera crew, he couldn't help but notice the stern expressions of the royal guards stationed at every corner. These weren't the ceremonial guards tourists photograph outside the gates. These were the real deal, highly trained security personnel, whose job was to protect the royal family at all costs. The lead guard, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and an immaculate uniform, stepped forward as Anderson's team approached the interview location. His name tag read Captain Williams, and everything about his demeanor suggested he took his job very seriously. He had served in the British Army for 15 years before joining the Royal Protection Unit, and his reputation for being thorough was well known among palace staff. "Mr. Cooper," Captain Williams said in a crisp British accent, "I need to remind you of the agreed-upon guidelines for today's interview. You have 30 minutes and you must stick to the pre-approved questions. Any deviation from the established protocol will result in immediate termination of the interview." Anderson nodded, though something in the guard's tone made him slightly uneasy. He had interviewed presidents, world leaders, and celebrities without such strict limitations. But this was the royal family, and he understood that different rules applied here. His producer, Sarah Martinez, gave him an encouraging nod from behind the camera setup. The interview began smoothly enough. Anderson asked about upcoming charitable events, the family's commitment to environmental causes, and their plans for community outreach. The responses were polished and diplomatic, exactly what one would expect from senior members of the royal family. The camera crew worked quietly, capturing every moment with professional precision. However, as the interview progressed, Anderson began to notice something troubling. Every time he attempted to ask a follow-up question or probe slightly deeper into a topic, Captain Williams would clear his throat meaningfully from his position near the doorway. It was a subtle but unmistakable warning that Anderson was approaching the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Anderson had built his career on asking tough questions and getting to the heart of important issues. He wasn't accustomed to being so heavily managed during an interview, and the restrictions began to feel increasingly stifling. The journalist in him started to push against these invisible barriers, even though he knew he was walking on thin ice. As they approached the 20-minute mark, Anderson decided to ask about a recent controversy that had been making headlines in the British press. It wasn't anything scandalous, just a question about how the royal family planned to address certain criticisms about their spending on official events during a time when many British citizens were struggling economically. The moment the words left Anderson's mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. Captain Williams stepped forward, his expression darkening like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The royal family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging quick glances that spoke volumes about their displeasure. "Mr. Cooper," Captain Williams interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "that question was not on the approved list. I'm going to have to ask you to move on to the next pre-approved topic immediately." Anderson felt his journalistic instincts kick into high gear. This was exactly the kind of moment that separated real journalism from public relations fluff, and he wasn't about to back down without at least trying to do his job properly. The camera was still rolling, capturing every second of this unexpected confrontation. "With respect, Captain Williams," Anderson replied, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing tension. "This is a legitimate question about a matter of public interest. The British people have a right to hear their royal family's perspective on these important issues. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the middle of a medieval court. Captain William's jaw tightened, and Anderson could see that he had just crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. The careful choreography of the interview had been shattered. And now everyone in the room was improvising in uncharted territory. The royal family members looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly caught between their desire to maintain their public image and their obligation to follow the strict protocols that governed all their interactions with the media. Anderson's camera crew continued filming, recognizing that they might be witnessing something unprecedented in the usually carefully controlled world of royal interviews. What happened next would transform a routine publicity interview into one of the most talked about media confrontations in recent memory, setting the stage for a clash between journalistic integrity and institutional authority that neither side had anticipated when the day began. Captain Williams took another step closer to Anderson, his military bearing unmistakable as he positioned himself between the journalist and the royal family members. The decorative grandfather clock in the corner of the blue drawing room seemed to tick louder in the sudden silence, each second stretching like an eternity as everyone waited to see who would blink first in this unexpected standoff. "Mr. Cooper," the captain said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I am not going to repeat myself. You will either return to the approved questions or this interview will be terminated immediately. These are not negotiable terms." Anderson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire career had been built on moments exactly like this one, where the choice was between taking the safe path or pursuing the truth regardless of the consequences. He glanced at his producer Sarah, who was frantically making hand gestures from behind the camera, clearly trying to signal him to back down and salvage what remained of the interview. But Anderson Cooper hadn't become one of America's most respected journalists by backing down when things got uncomfortable. He had reported from war zones, confronted corrupt politicians, and challenged some of the most powerful people in the world. The idea of being silenced by protocol in what was supposed to be a free press interview went against everything he believed in as a journalist. "Captain Williams," Anderson said, his voice steady but firm, "I understand you have a job to do. But so do I. The American people, and frankly the British people as well, expect their journalists to ask real questions, not just read from a script prepared by Palace public relations staff. This isn't a promotional video. It's supposed to be journalism." The royal family members exchanged increasingly worried glances. They had participated in hundreds of interviews over the years, but none had ever deteriorated quite like this one. The usual smooth professionalism that characterized their public appearances was rapidly giving way to something much more unpredictable and potentially embarrassing. Captain Williams' face had turned a shade of red that almost matched the royal crimson carpet beneath their feet. His years of military training had taught him to maintain discipline under pressure, but Anderson's persistent challenge to his authority was testing the limits of his professional composure. "Mr. Cooper," he said through gritted teeth, "you seem to be laboring under the mistaken impression that this is some kind of American press conference where you can ask whatever you want. This is Buckingham Palace, and you are here as a guest of Her Majesty's household. You will show proper respect, or you will be escorted from the premises." Anderson's camera operator, a veteran journalist himself named Mike Rodriguez, continued filming despite the growing tension. He had covered enough breaking news stories to recognize when something newsworthy was happening, and his professional instincts told him to keep the camera rolling no matter what happened next. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond what anyone had anticipated when the day began. What was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated public relations exercise had turned into something resembling a diplomatic incident. With both sides now firmly entrenched in their positions, Anderson made a decision that would define not only the rest of the interview, but potentially his entire relationship with one of the world's most important institutions. Instead of backing down, he leaned forward slightly and asked his follow-up question anyway. speaking directly to the royal family members while completely ignoring Captain William's increasingly angry presence. "Given the current economic challenges facing British families," Anderson said, his voice calm but determined, "how do you justify the enormous expense of some recent royal ceremonies when food banks are reporting record numbers of visitors?" The question landed like a bombshell in the elegant room. It was exactly the kind of direct, challenging inquiry that palace protocols were specifically designed to prevent. And everyone present knew that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Captain William's reaction was immediate and explosive. His military training kicked in as he stepped directly into Anderson's line of sight, blocking the camera's view of the royal family and effectively taking control of the situation through sheer physical presence. "That's enough," he barked, his voice echoing off the silk-covered walls with the force of a command given on a battlefield. "This interview is over. Security, please escort Mr. Cooper and his team from the palace immediately." 2 additional guards appeared in the doorway as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Their synchronized movements suggested they had rehearsed this scenario many times, though probably never expecting to actually use it during what was supposed to be a friendly publicity interview. Anderson remained seated for a moment, looking directly into the camera as he realized that his pursuit of journalistic integrity had just created an international incident. The royal family members sat frozen in their chairs, clearly unsure whether they should try to defuse the situation or simply let the security protocols take their course. Sarah, Anderson's producer, began frantically packing up equipment while trying to salvage whatever footage they had managed to capture before everything fell apart. She knew that regardless of how this situation resolved itself, they had just witnessed something that would make headlines around the world. The confrontation had reached a point where there was no graceful way for either side to back down without losing face, setting the stage for an even more dramatic conclusion to what had started as a routine royal interview. Anderson slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and measured as he faced Captain Williams across the now electric atmosphere of the Blue Drawing Room. The CNN anchor's years of experience in high-pressure situations served him well as he maintained his composure despite the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding around him. "Captain Williams," Anderson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had interviewed world leaders and wasn't easily intimidated, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're ending this interview and having me escorted out because I asked a legitimate question about public spending. Is that really the message you want to send to the international media?" The captain's military posture remained rigid, but Anderson could see something flickering in his eyes. Perhaps it was the recognition that this confrontation was being filmed and would likely be seen by millions of people around the world. Perhaps it was the awareness that his heavy-handed response might actually create a bigger public relations disaster than the original question would have caused. But Captain Williams had made his decision, and his military training didn't allow for backing down once a line had been drawn. "Mr. Cooper," he replied, his voice still stern but now carrying a hint of uncertainty, "you were given clear guidelines before this interview began. You chose to violate those guidelines despite repeated warnings. The consequences are entirely your responsibility." Anderson's camera operator Mike continued filming, capturing every word and gesture of this extraordinary confrontation. He had covered enough major news events to understand that they were witnessing something that would likely be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The footage they were capturing might become one of the most watched royal-related videos in internet history. The royal family members remained seated but clearly uncomfortable, caught between their desire to maintain diplomatic relations with the American media and their obligation to support the security protocols that governed their lives. Their silence spoke volumes about the impossible position they found themselves in. Anderson made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of arguing further or allowing himself to be escorted out quietly, he turned directly to address the camera, speaking to his audience as if Captain Williams and the guards weren't even there. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anderson said, looking directly into the lens with the confidence of a seasoned broadcaster. What you're witnessing here is an unfortunate example of how some institutions respond when journalists ask questions they'd prefer not to answer. This was supposed to be an interview about charitable work and community engagement, but it's turned into something quite different. Captain Williams stepped forward immediately, his face now completely flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Cooper, you will stop filming immediately. This is not a press conference, and you do not have permission to make statements to your audience from within these premises." But Anderson continued speaking, his years of live television experience allowing him to remain calm and articulate even as palace security closed in around him. "The question I asked was about public accountability during difficult economic times. It's the kind of question that any responsible journalist would ask. And the response we've seen today raises serious concerns about transparency and media access." The situation had now evolved far beyond a simple interview disagreement. It had become a very public confrontation between one of America's most respected journalists and one of the world's most prestigious institutions, with both sides playing to an audience that extended far beyond the ornate walls of Buckingham Palace. Sarah, Anderson's producer, recognized that they were now in uncharted territory. She continued coordinating with the camera crew while simultaneously trying to document everything that was happening. Her media law training told her that they were probably within their rights to continue filming until they were actually physically removed from the premises. But the diplomatic implications of pushing too hard were potentially enormous. Captain Williams gestured sharply to the two guards who had appeared in the doorway. "Gentlemen, please escort these individuals from the palace grounds immediately. Confiscate any recording equipment if they refuse to cooperate voluntarily." The mention of confiscating equipment triggered an immediate response from Anderson's team. Mike, the camera operator, instinctively stepped back while continuing to film, knowing that any attempt to seize their equipment would likely escalate the situation even further and create additional legal complications for the palace. "Captain Williams," Anderson said, his journalistic instincts now in full control, "are you seriously threatening to confiscate equipment belonging to an accredited member of the international press? Because if you are, I want to make sure our viewers understand exactly what's happening here." The captain found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Every word and action was being recorded, and he was beginning to realize that his aggressive response might be causing more problems than Anderson's original question would have created. The palace's public relations team would undoubtedly have preferred to handle this situation with more diplomatic finesse. One of the royal family members finally spoke up, their voice barely audible in the tense atmosphere. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess to discuss how to proceed," they suggested diplomatically, clearly hoping to find some way to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control, but it was too late for diplomatic solutions. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own, with both Anderson and Captain Williams now committed to their respective positions. The next few minutes would determine whether this incident would be remembered as a minor diplomatic embarrassment or as a major international news story about press freedom and institutional transparency. The tension in the blue drawing room reached a breaking point as Anderson made his most decisive move yet. Rather than waiting for the guards to escort him out, he stood up straighter and addressed the camera, with the kind of authoritative presence that had made him one of television's most trusted journalists. "What's happening here today is bigger than just one interview," Anderson declared, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. "This is about whether legitimate questions can be asked of public institutions, or whether protocol and tradition are more important than accountability and transparency." Captain Williams' face had moved beyond red into a deeper shade of purple. His military training had prepared him for many situations, but dealing with a defiant American journalist who refused to be intimidated was testing every ounce of his professional restraint. The situation was spiraling beyond anything covered in palace security protocols. "Mr. Cooper," the captain said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge, "you have 10 seconds to turn off that camera and leave these premises voluntarily. or I will have you removed by force. This is not a negotiation. But Anderson had crossed his own Rubicon. Years of reporting from conflict zones and confronting powerful people had taught him that sometimes the most important stories came from moments when institutions showed their true nature under pressure. He wasn't about to waste this opportunity. "Captain Williams," Anderson replied, maintaining eye contact with the increasingly furious guard, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to do. You're representing one of the world's most respected institutions, and right now, millions of people are watching how that institution handles a simple question about public accountability." The royal family members looked mortified. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become a public relations nightmare that was being broadcast live to Anderson's audience. They could see their carefully maintained public image being damaged with every passing second of this confrontation. Mike, the camera operator, continued filming despite the increasingly threatening presence of the palace guards. His professional experience told him that this footage would be historically significant, regardless of how the immediate confrontation resolved itself. He had covered enough major news events to recognize when he was witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Captain Williams finally lost the last of his composure. "Right, that's it," he barked, gesturing aggressively to the two guards. "Remove them now. Use whatever force is necessary." The guards stepped forward, but Anderson held his ground. "Are you really going to have me physically dragged out of here for asking about public spending?" he asked, his voice remaining calm despite the escalating threat. "Because if you are, I want everyone watching to see exactly how this institution treats journalists who ask uncomfortable questions." The standoff had reached its climax. Captain Williams realized that any physical confrontation would be captured on camera and broadcast around the world, potentially causing irreparable damage to the royal family's reputation. But he had committed himself to a course of action and couldn't back down without losing all authority. Sarah, Anderson's producer, made a crucial decision. She stepped forward with her hands raised in a gesture of peace, speaking directly to Captain Williams with the diplomatic skill that had made her successful in international journalism. "Captain Williams," she said, her voice professionally calm, "we're going to leave voluntarily to avoid any further escalation. But I want you to understand that this entire confrontation is going to be part of our news report. The way this has been handled will be the story, not just the original interview." Her words hit Captain Williams like a splash of cold water. He suddenly realized that his aggressive response had transformed a minor question about royal spending into a major international story about press freedom and institutional transparency. The palace's public relations team would be furious. When they discovered how badly this situation had been mismanaged, Anderson began packing up his materials, but he wasn't finished making his point. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, speaking one final time to his camera, "what you've witnessed here today is what happens when institutions prioritize control over accountability. We came here to discuss charitable work, but instead we've learned something much more significant about how some organizations respond to legitimate questions." Captain Williams wanted to stop Anderson from making this final statement, but he realized that any further intervention would only make the situation worse. The damage was already done, and additional confrontation would only provide more ammunition for Anderson's eventual news report. The guards flanked Anderson's team as they gathered their equipment, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Captain Williams had regained enough of his composure to recognize that he needed to minimize further damage rather than escalate the confrontation even more. As Anderson and his crew walked toward the exit, followed by the stern-faced guards, the royal family members remained in their chairs, clearly stunned by how quickly their routine interview had transformed into an international incident. They knew that this story would dominate news cycles for days, if not weeks. Anderson paused at the doorway and turned back one final time. "Thank you for your time," he said with professional courtesy, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I hope in the future we can have a more productive conversation about the important issues facing the British people." With that, he walked out of Buckingham Palace, leaving behind a room full of people trying to figure out how to explain What had just happened to their superiors and to the world media that would inevitably pick up this story within hours? Within hours of Anderson Cooper's explosive departure from Buckingham Palace, the story had become the lead headline on news networks around the world. The footage of his confrontation with Captain Williams spread across social media platforms like wildfire, with millions of viewers sharing, commenting, and debating what they had witnessed in the Blue Drawing Room. Anderson sat in his London hotel room that evening, reviewing the footage with his producer Sarah and considering how to present the story to his viewers. The raw emotion and tension of the confrontation was even more striking when watched back, and both journalists knew they had captured something unprecedented in the usually controlled world of royal media interactions. "This is going to change everything," Sarah said, scrolling through the flood of messages and interview requests that had been pouring in since news of the incident broke. "Every major news organization in the world wants to talk to us about what happened in there." Back at Buckingham Palace, Captain Williams found himself in the most difficult position of his distinguished career. The palace communications team had called an emergency meeting to discuss damage control strategies, and the captain's aggressive handling of the situation was being questioned at the highest levels of the royal household. The palace press secretary, Margaret Thornton, paced nervously around her office as she tried to craft a statement that would minimize the public relations disaster. How did a routine charity interview turn into an international incident about press freedom? She asked rhetorically, knowing that Captain Williams' heavy-handed response had created exactly the kind of controversy the royal family worked so hard to avoid. Meanwhile, the royal family members who had been present during the interview were dealing with their own crisis. They understood that their silence during the confrontation would be interpreted as either approval of Captain Williams' actions or inability to control their own security staff. Either interpretation was damaging to their carefully cultivated public image. Anderson's report aired that night on CNN to record-breaking viewership. The footage of his confrontation with Captain Williams became some of the most watched royal-related content in years, but for all the wrong reasons. Anderson presented the story with his characteristic professionalism, allowing the footage to speak for itself while providing context about press freedom and institutional accountability. What happened today at Buckingham Palace raises serious questions about transparency and media access, Anderson told his viewers. When a simple question about public spending during economic hardship leads to threats and forced removal, we have to ask ourselves what other questions these institutions would prefer never be asked. The international response was immediate and overwhelming. Journalism organizations around the world issued statements supporting Anderson's right to ask legitimate questions, while media law experts debated the implications of the palace's response. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting press freedom and criticizing institutional overreach. Captain Williams watched Anderson's report from his quarters, recognizing that his military approach to what should have been a diplomatic situation had backfired spectacularly. His attempt to protect the royal family from uncomfortable questions had instead created a much bigger story about their inability to handle legitimate media scrutiny. The palace's official response, when it finally came, was carefully worded but ultimately unsatisfactory. They expressed regret for the misunderstanding and emphasized their commitment to media relations. But they stopped short of apologizing for Captain Williams' actions or acknowledging that Anderson's questions were legitimate. The story continued to dominate headlines for weeks. Other journalists began investigating the broader questions about royal spending that Anderson had originally tried to ask, creating exactly the kind of sustained negative coverage that the palace's aggressive response had been meant to prevent. The incident had turned a single, uncomfortable question into a comprehensive media examination of royal finances and transparency. Anderson found himself becoming an unexpected symbol of press freedom, invited to speak at journalism conferences and media freedom events around the world. The confrontation at Buckingham Palace had elevated him from respected journalist to something approaching a folk hero among his peers. Captain Williams, meanwhile, faced an internal investigation into his handling of the situation. While his superiors acknowledged his dedication to protecting the royal family, they also recognized that his approach had created far more problems than Anderson's original question would have caused. The incident fundamentally changed the relationship between the royal family and the international media. Future interviews became even more heavily scripted and controlled. But journalists around the world now had a perfect example of what happened when legitimate questions were met with intimidation rather than answers. Years later, media historians would point to Anderson Cooper's confrontation with Captain Williams as a turning point in discussions about institutional accountability and press freedom. What had started as a routine charity interview had become a case study in how not to handle media relations, and a reminder that in the digital age, aggressive responses to journalism often create bigger problems than the original questions would have caused. The Blue Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace returned to hosting carefully controlled interviews and photo opportunities, but the memory of that explosive morning lingered. Anderson Cooper had proven that even the most prestigious institutions couldn't simply silence uncomfortable questions through intimidation, and that sometimes the most important stories came from moments when powerful people revealed their true nature under pressure.